Welcome to our lecture series on environmental science. In this first part, we are going to dive deep into the foundational themes that govern our natural world, exploring how complex systems operate, how vital elements cycle through the Earth, and what makes ecosystems tick. Let us get started. One of the most critical concepts in environmental science is carrying capacity. This is not just about how many individuals can squeeze into a space right now, it is about sustainability. It is the maximum population an environment can support indefinitely without degrading the resources needed for future generations. When we ask why we should protect the environment, we usually rely on two main justifications. The utilitarian, or materialistic justification, argues that nature is valuable because it provides economic benefits or resources essential for our survival. On the other hand, the ecological justification argues that ecosystems are inherently valuable because they support a web of life, providing systemic benefits that might not have an immediate price tag, but are crucial for planetary health. Environmental science is, at its core, driven by the scientific method. Science is not just a collection of facts, it is an active process. Through rigorous testing, it results in conclusions, theories, and laws. Importantly, modern science relies on testability. If an idea cannot be tested through observation, it generally falls outside the realm of scientific inquiry. To test our ideas, we need observations. We can use our five senses, or we can use advanced instruments to measure things we cannot see or feel, like microscopic pollutants. The data we collect falls into two categories: qualitative data, which is descriptive and non-numerical, like identifying a species of bird, and quantitative data, which involves numbers, such as measuring the exact concentration of a toxin in a water sample. When we analyze quantitative data, we look for relationships between variables. The independent variable is the cause. It is what the investigator believes is driving a change. The dependent variable is the effect. It is the outcome that changes in response to the independent variable. Understanding this cause and effect relationship is how we build scientific models. Now, let us apply this scientific lens to the natural world by looking at complex systems. A system is simply a set of interacting parts that function together as a whole. Whether it is your own body, a car engine, or a global climate network, all systems fundamentally involve the flow and storage of matter and energy. Systems interact with their surroundings in different ways. In an open system, both matter and energy flow in and out. The ocean is a great example. It gains water from rivers and loses it to evaporation. A closed system, however, does not exchange matter with its surroundings. Earth itself is essentially a materially closed system. We do not gain or lose significant amounts of physical matter, even though we constantly receive energy from the sun. Systems can also be categorized by how they behave over time. A static system remains in a fixed condition. Historically, scientists believed in classical stability, the idea that natural systems were static and would always return to a perfect baseline after a disturbance. However, modern science recognizes that most natural environments are dynamic systems. They are constantly changing, adapting, and evolving over time. Let us look at how matter moves through a system. In a steady-state system, the inputs exactly match the outputs. Because what goes in equals what comes out, the amount of material stored inside the system stays exactly the same. A sustainable forestry practice, where you plant one new tree for every single tree you cut down, is a perfect example of a steady state. Conversely, we have non-steady state systems. In the first scenario, the inputs are less than the outputs. Because more is leaving the system than entering it, the internal storage decreases over time. The extraction of fossil fuels is a classic example. We are pulling oil and coal out of the ground far faster than the Earth can naturally replace them, leading to depletion. The second type of non-steady state system occurs when inputs are greater than outputs. In this case, the storage within the system increases and accumulates. A dangerous example of this is pollution. If toxins flow into a lake faster than they can be broken down or flushed out, the concentration of toxins in that reservoir will steadily rise. To make this concrete, imagine a nightclub. The input is the people waiting in line to get in. The storage is the number of patrons currently inside dancing. The output is the people leaving to go home. If the bouncer lets one person in for every person who leaves, the club is in a steady state. If they let people in faster than they leave, the storage increases and the club becomes dangerously overcrowded. We can apply the exact same logic to a timber plantation. The input is the number of saplings planted, the storage is a total number of mature trees, and the output is the timber harvested. If the logging company gets greedy and cuts down more than they plant, the system enters a non-steady state, and the forest shrinks. This concept is highly relevant to climate change. Look at this glacier. The input is accumulation from snowfall. The output is ablation, which means melting and calving. Because global temperatures are rising, the output, melting, far exceeds the input. The storage of ice is rapidly decreasing, resulting in severe glacial retreat.
We also see systems thinking in human geography. Consider urban migration. The input is people moving into the city, and the output is people moving away. In most modern cities, immigration far outpaces emigration. This non-steady state results in a rapidly increasing urban population, which puts pressure on city infrastructure and resources. Returning to environmental hazards, consider lake pollution. The input is the runoff of chemicals and trash. The output is the natural breakdown or flushing of those pollutants. When industrial waste enters the water faster than the ecosystem can process it, the storage of pollution increases, devastating the local aquatic life. Perhaps the most critical system we monitor today is atmospheric carbon dioxide. The input is CO2 from burning fossil fuels and deforestation. The output is CO2 absorbed by oceans and forests. Currently, human activity has pushed the system into a drastic non-steady state. The inputs vastly exceed the outputs, causing the storage of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere to climb. In reality, nature is rarely just one simple box. A system usually consists of a variety of interconnected compartments. The output of one compartment directly becomes the input for the next. For example, the carbon output from a burning forest becomes the input for the atmospheric compartment, which then becomes the input for the ocean compartment as it dissolves into the water. Because these compartments are connected, they create feedback loops, which occur when the output of a system circles back to affect its own input. Negative feedback is stabilizing. It means that an increase in output now will trigger a decrease in output later, keeping the system in check. Negative feedback is absolutely required for any steady-state system to maintain its balance. Positive feedback, on the other hand, is additive and highly destabilizing. In a positive feedback loop, an increase in output now leads to an even greater increase in output later. This creates a runaway train effect, often referred to in environmental science as a vicious cycle, where a problem continuously amplifies itself. Let us look at a real-world case study, the Amazon rainforest. Spanning 6.5 million square kilometers across South America, it is a massive, complex ecosystem. However, it is under severe threat from large-scale deforestation, with an estimated 20% of the forest already completely lost to human activity. The Amazon is currently trapped in a terrifying positive feedback loop. When deforestation occurs, there are fewer trees to release moisture into the air through evapotranspiration. Less moisture means less rainfall. Less rainfall leads to intense droughts. These droughts weaken the remaining forest, making it more susceptible to fires and die-offs, which causes even more deforestation. The cycle feeds itself. Another alarming case study is permafrost meltdown. Permafrost is ground that remains completely frozen year-round, covering about 24% of the exposed land in the Northern Hemisphere. But as global temperatures rise, we have to ask a critical question. What happens to the global system when a quarter of the hemisphere's ground begins to unfreeze? The answer lies in carbon storage. High-latitude permafrost ecosystems store almost twice as much carbon in their frozen soils as is currently floating in our entire atmosphere. When this ground thaws, ancient organic matter unfreezes. Microbes immediately begin decomposing this material, releasing massive amounts of carbon dioxide and methane directly into the air. It only takes a temperature increase of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius to trigger widespread subsurface melting. This causes the ground to collapse, forming what are known as thermokarst lakes. As the trapped methane and CO2 bubble up through these lakes into the atmosphere, they trap more heat, warming the planet further, which melts even more permafrost. This is another classic, dangerous positive feedback loop. When we push these systems, their responses can be linear or nonlinear. In a linear process, the response is proportional and predictable. Adding 1 unit of input always yields the exact same change in output. But environmental systems are usually nonlinear. In a nonlinear process, the system's reaction depends on its current state. A small input might do nothing at first, but later, that same small input could trigger a massive collapse. Another tricky aspect of system responses is lag time. This is the delay between the cause of a problem and the visible appearance of its effect. For example, if we dump pollution into a groundwater aquifer, it might take decades for that contaminated water to reach a drinking well. This lag time makes it very difficult to recognize and react to environmental damage before it is too late.
When populations ignore carrying capacity and lag times, we see a phenomenon called overshoot and collapse. As you can see on this graph, a population grows exponentially, blowing right past the environment's carrying capacity. Because resources are exhausted, the system cannot sustain the numbers, resulting in a devastating population collapse, which often degrades the environment so badly that the new carrying capacity is permanently lowered. Ultimately, pushing systems too far leads to irreversible consequences. In environmental science, irreversible means the damage cannot be fixed on a human timescale of decades or centuries. Soil erosion is a prime example. Poor farming practices can wash away topsoil in just a few years, but it takes the Earth thousands of years of geologic and biological processes to generate new, fertile soil. This brings us to the grand mechanisms that sustain the Earth, biogeochemical cycles. This is the complete path that a chemical element takes through the Earth's systems. The name tells you exactly how it works. Bio, because it involves living organisms, geo, because it moves through rocks, water, and air, and chemical, because it is specific elements like carbon or nitrogen being recycled. These chemicals travel through 4 major reservoirs. The atmosphere is the layer of gases surrounding the planet. The lithosphere is the solid outer crust, including continents and the ocean floor. The hydrosphere encompasses all the water on Earth, from deep oceans to atmospheric clouds. And finally, the biosphere is the interconnected web of all places on Earth where life exists. Life requires specific chemicals to function. Macronutrients are elements needed in massive quantities, specifically the big 6: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Micronutrients, like copper, are needed only in trace amounts. However, an organism's growth is dictated by its limiting factor. This is the single essential nutrient that is in the shortest supply, relative to what the organism needs to grow. As elements move through biogeochemical cycles, they travel between compartments. A compartment that donates an element is called a source. A compartment that receives and stores that element is called a sink. For example, when a tree burns, the forest is the source of carbon, and the atmosphere acts as the sink receiving it. Underpinning all of these chemical movements is the geological cycle. This is a master term that describes the physical processes responsible for forming and changing the Earth's materials over millions of years. It is actually composed of 3 distinct subcycles: the tectonic cycle, the rock cycle, and the hydrological cycle. The tectonic cycle involves the continuous creation and destruction of the Earth's lithosphere. The Earth's crust is fractured into massive plates that float on the hotter, denser mantle below, moving a few centimeters every year. This movement reshapes continents, alters global climate patterns by changing ocean currents, and creates isolated habitats where new species can evolve. When plates collide, we get convergent boundaries, which destroy existing crust. If a dense oceanic plate hits a lighter continental plate, the ocean plate is forced downward, melting and creating volcanoes, like the Andes. If 2 continental plates crash, they buckle upwards to form massive mountain ranges like the Himalayas. If 2 oceanic plates collide, the subduction creates volcanic island chains. Conversely, divergent boundaries occur where plates pull apart. Magma rises to fill the gap, creating brand new lithosphere. This mostly happens at mid-ocean ridges, slowly widening oceans like the Atlantic. Finally, transform boundaries happen where plates simply grind sideways past one another. No crust is created or destroyed here, but the friction causes severe earthquakes, such as along the San Andreas Fault. The second part of the geological cycle is the rock cycle, which continuously transforms rocks between igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic states through heat, pressure, and weathering. This cycle is crucial for life because rocks act as massive sinks for elements like carbon and calcium, and as they weather away, they release essential mineral nutrients back into the soil and water. The third component is the hydrologic cycle, driven entirely by solar energy. This is the continuous transfer of water from the oceans up into the atmosphere via evaporation, down onto the land as precipitation, and eventually flowing back to the sea through rivers and groundwater. Plants also play a huge role by pulling water from the soil and releasing it into the air through transpiration. While the Earth is covered in water, its distribution is highly unequal. 97% is saltwater in the oceans, 2% is locked in glaciers. That leaves a tiny fraction of a percent as accessible freshwater in groundwater, lakes, and rivers. Because this life-sustaining resource is so scarce and unevenly distributed, it heavily dictates where ecosystems can thrive and where humans can build civilizations. Now, let us trace a specific element, carbon. In the atmosphere, carbon exists as gases like carbon dioxide and methane. It is constantly being removed by plant photosynthesis and by dissolving into the oceans. However, it is continuously pumped back into the air through animal respiration, natural decay, wildfires, volcanic eruptions, and, most significantly today, the human burning of fossil fuels. In the hydrosphere, carbon dissolves directly into the water or forms carbonate ions. It is removed from the water when marine algae perform photosynthesis or when sea creatures use the carbon to build their calcium carbonate shells. Carbon is introduced back into the ocean through the respiration of marine life and by rivers washing organic particles down from the land. In the biosphere, carbon is the physical building block of life. Plants absorb it, animals eat the plants, and decomposers break them all down. Over millions of years, dead organic matter that escapes decomposition gets buried in the lithosphere. Geologic pressure squeezes out other elements, leaving dense carbon behind as coal, oil, and natural gas. Marine shells also compress to form limestone, creating a massive long-term carbon sink. Wetlands play a unique and vital role in the carbon cycle. Because the soil in a wetland is constantly waterlogged, it lacks oxygen. This low oxygen environment severely slows down the bacteria that would normally decompose dead plants. As a result, the dead plant matter builds up as peat, safely trapping the carbon in the ground for thousands of years, making wetlands incredibly effective carbon sinks. All these cycles come together to support ecosystems. An ecosystem has two fundamental parts. The living part is the ecological community, all the interacting plants, animals, and microbes. The non-living part is the physical and chemical environment they inhabit, including the air, the water, and the mineral soil or aquatic substrate. To keep an ecosystem alive, two major processes must constantly occur. First, the chemical elements we just discussed must cycle through the living and non-living parts. Second, energy must continuously flow through the system to power the work of living and growing. Within a living community, energy and elements are transferred through feeding relationships. A simple linear path of who eats whom is a food chain. But nature is complex, so these chains overlap to form intricate food webs. We categorize organisms by their trophic level, which simply means how many feeding steps they are away from the ecosystem's original energy source, which is almost always the sun. At the base, the first trophic level belongs to autotrophs, like green plants, which use photosynthesis to make their own food. Everything else is a heterotroph, meaning they must eat others to survive. Herbivores form the second trophic level by eating plants. Carnivores form the third and fourth levels by eating the herbivores. Finally, decomposers sit at the highest level, recycling the dead matter from all the levels below. Within these food webs, some species hold the entire system together. We call these keystone species. If you remove a keystone species, the ecosystem drastically changes or collapses. Originally, scientists thought only top predators could be keystone species, keeping prey populations in check. But modern ecology has proven that herbivores and plants can be keystone species too. A fantastic example of a non-predator keystone species is the white rhinoceros. Weighing over 1,000 kilograms, these mega herbivores act as ecosystem engineers. By constantly grazing, they physically alter the landscape, creating habitats and food sources that countless other smaller species rely on to survive. Interestingly, white rhinos also control fire dynamics. Because they consume massive amounts of savanna grass, they remove the fuel that wildfires need to spread. If poachers remove the rhinos from the ecosystem, the grass grows tall and thick. When a fire inevitably starts, it burns much hotter, larger, and more continuously, devastating the landscape. To understand why ecosystems need constant inputs, we must look at physics. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. The second law of thermodynamics states that every time energy is transformed, like an animal digesting a plant to run, some of that energy is degraded into disorganized heat. This heat is lost to the environment as entropy. Because of this constant loss of heat, the flow of energy through an ecosystem is strictly a one-way street. Unlike chemical elements, energy does not cycle. It comes in from the sun, is used by plants, passed to animals, and eventually all radiates away as heat. Therefore, every ecosystem must be permanently plugged into an external energy source to survive.
Ecosystems are not static. They develop over time through a process called succession. Primary succession happens from scratch, in places completely devoid of life, like a fresh lava flow or bare rock. Secondary succession happens after a disaster, like a forest fire, where the ecosystem is damaged but the soil and some seeds still remain, allowing life to bounce back much faster. Different plants thrive at different stages of this recovery. Early successional species, or pioneers, are the first to arrive. They grow fast, spread seeds quickly, and thrive in harsh, open sunlight. As they enrich the soil, late successional species move in. These are slower-growing, long-lived trees that eventually outcompete the pioneers by shading them out, forming a mature, stable forest. As ecosystems mature, they support biological diversity. This broad term encompasses the variety of life on Earth. We look at populations, which are groups of the same species living together. A species is defined as individuals capable of interbreeding. We also measure genetic diversity, the variety of DNA within a species, and habitat diversity, which is the variety of physical environments available. When ecologists measure species diversity, they look at three specific metrics. Species richness is simply the total count of different species present. Species evenness looks at the relative abundance. Are there equal numbers of lions, zebras, and elephants, or is it mostly just zebras? Finally, species dominance identifies which single species is the most numerically abundant in that ecosystem. The incredible diversity we see today is the result of biological evolution. This is the change in inherited traits from one generation to the next. Over long periods, this creates entirely new species. It is a strictly one-way process, driven by competition for resources. A species cannot evolve backward into its ancestor, and once a species goes extinct, it is gone forever. Evolution is driven by several mechanisms. First is mutation, which are random changes in DNA. These mutations create new traits, though they are not always beneficial. Second is migration and geographic isolation. If a population gets physically separated by a mountain or river, the two groups will evolve differently over time. If a species finds a brand new habitat with no competitors, it undergoes adaptive radiation, rapidly evolving into many new species to fill every available role. The guiding hand behind these changes is natural selection. Because there is natural variation in any population, some individuals will happen to have traits that make them better suited to their specific environment. Because they survive longer, they reproduce more. Over generations, those advantageous traits are passed down, and the descendants with those traits become the majority of the population. As species evolve, they interact. The most common interaction is competition. The competitive exclusion principle states that two species with the exact same requirements cannot survive in the same habitat. One will always outcompete the other. To survive, species develop unique ecological niches. If the habitat is their address, the niche is their profession, how they uniquely gather food and survive without directly overlapping with competitors. Other interactions include symbiosis, where two species develop a relationship that benefits both. In obligate symbiosis, the relationship is so tight that neither can survive without the other. On the darker side, we have predation, where one animal eats another, and parasitism, where an organism lives off a host, draining its resources without killing it immediately. Where these species live is dictated by geography and climate, a field called biogeography. The Earth is divided into biomes, which are broad types of ecosystems, like deserts or rainforests. Interestingly, because of the rule of climatic similarity, a desert in Africa and a desert in North America will produce plants and animals that look and act very similarly, even if they are completely unrelated. This brings us to convergent and divergent evolution. Convergent evolution is when unrelated species develop similar physical traits because they live in similar environments, like a shark and a dolphin both evolving fins. Divergent evolution is the opposite. Related species from the same ancestor migrate to different environments and evolve completely different body shapes to adapt to their new homes. When species migrate to isolated areas, the rules of island biogeography take over. First, islands always have fewer species than mainlands. Second, species only arrive via migration or local evolution. Third, smaller islands support fewer species. And fourth, the further the island is from the mainland, the fewer species will make the journey. This applies not just to islands in the ocean, but to any isolated habitat, like a mountain peak surrounded by desert. To wrap up this section, let us look at what controls biodiversity.
Diversity increases when habitats are physically varied, when there are moderate natural disturbances, and through the slow process of evolution. Conversely, diversity plummets in the face of extreme environmental stress, severe lack of resources, extreme unnatural disturbances, and the introduction of invasive exotic species. Next, we will look at how human activities, specifically agriculture, impact these delicate balances. Picking up right where we left off, let's dive into agriculture. Agriculture is the science and practice of farming, which includes cultivating soil and rearing livestock. It is classified as a primary economic activity, meaning it involves harvesting or extracting resources directly from the earth. Spatially, it is the most widespread of all primary activities, covering about 15 million square kilometers, which is roughly 10% of the Earth's surface area. When we look at farm economies where crops are grown almost exclusively for local consumption, we are talking about subsistence agriculture. This takes two main forms. Extensive subsistence agriculture involves using large areas of land with minimal labor input per hectare, such as nomadic herding. On the other hand, intensive subsistence agriculture involves cultivating very small landholdings, but it requires the expenditure of great amounts of labor per hectare, like tending to small, dense urban garden plots. In contrast, commercial agriculture involves production primarily for a market off the farm itself, rather than for the farmer's own survival. Extensive commercial agriculture is usually found farther away from the market on less expensive land. Because the land is cheap, there's less need to use it intensively, leading to massive farm units like large maize farms. Intensive commercial agriculture, however, involves farmers applying large amounts of capital, like expensive machinery and fertilizers, and labor per unit of land, to produce crops with high yields and high market value. As the global population grows, we see increased pressure on our available agricultural land. This brings us to the concept of physiological density, which is the number of persons per unit area of cultivable land. As population rises, physiological density increases, meaning each patch of farmable land has to support more people. Furthermore, the world's food supply is heavily influenced by social disruptions. Social instability makes it incredibly difficult to maintain sustained agricultural yields. When agricultural systems fail, starvation occurs, manifesting in two distinct ways. Undernourishment results from simply not getting enough calories. A person has little to no energy to work or move, eventually leading to death. This is what we see in obvious, dramatic, and fast-acting famines. Malnourishment, however, is the lack of specific chemical components in food, such as proteins or vitamins. It is long-term and insidious. While people might not die immediately, they can suffer permanent impairment, including severe brain damage. Let's look at the foundation of agriculture, soil. Soil isn't just dirt. It's a natural body composed of minerals, organic compounds, living organisms, air, and water, all interacting through physical, chemical, and biological processes. When we dig down, we see soil horizons, which are vertical layers showing differences in texture, color, or structure. A vertical section through all these horizons is called a soil profile. Soil fertility is its capacity to supply nutrients for plant growth. Crucially, you must realize that soil contains entire complex ecosystems within itself. Agriculture and the environment are intimately interconnected. The specific soil and climatic conditions of a region dictate what kind of agricultural practices can be used there. Unfortunately, these practices can have negative impacts on the surrounding environment, affecting local ecosystems, the physical and chemical properties of the soil, and surface water quality. It is vital to understand that these impacts are highly interconnected. They ripple through the environment and never occur in isolation. When we farm, we create what is called an agroecosystem. This is an ecosystem created by agriculture, and it typically has very low genetic, species, and habitat diversity compared to nature. Agroecosystems differ from natural ecosystems in 5 key ways. First, biological diversity and food chains are drastically simplified. Second, the focus is usually on monoculture, growing a single crop. Third, crops are planted in neat, artificial rows. Fourth, they require plowing, which disturbs the soil. And fifth, they increasingly include genetically modified crops. To make room for these agroecosystems, we often turn to deforestation, which is the clearing of land through the total removal of forest cover. Historically, there have been 2 primary reasons for this. The first is clearing land for agriculture and human settlement. The second is harvesting the trees themselves for lumber, paper products, and fuel. The scale is staggering. The deforestation rate in the 21st century is estimated at 73,000 square kilometers per year.
The impacts of deforestation are severe across multiple systems. For ecosystems, it means the removal of mature, late successional communities, a massive reduction in ecological complexity, and widespread habitat destruction, leading to species loss. For soils, removing tree roots leads to accelerated erosion. We've lost over 5.62 million square kilometers of topsoil globally. It also causes soil compaction and increases the frequency of landslides.
Moving to livestock, we utilize two main types of land, rangeland and pasture. Rangeland provides food for grazing and browsing animals naturally, without any plowing or planting. Pasture, however, is actively plowed, planted, and harvested, specifically to provide forage for animals. A major issue today is that much of the world's rangeland is in poor condition due to overgrazing. The severity of grazing impacts depends heavily on the density of the herbivore population relative to the land's carrying capacity. When carrying capacity is exceeded, grazing has severe environmental impacts. In the ecosystem, trampling and overgrazing destroy vegetation and break down the overall ecosystem structure. In the soil, the heavy hooves of cattle cause severe compaction of the soil surface and physically destroy fragile riverbanks. This leads directly to surface water impacts, including pollution from cattle excrement, which alters the biological oxygen demand of the water, and increased sediment loads from the eroded banks.
We can look at soil erosion through the lens of systems theory. The input is the natural process of soil formation, which is incredibly slow. The storage is our global soil reservoir, the total amount of global soils available for agriculture. The output is the loss of soil, primarily through erosion. When the output from erosion exceeds the input from soil formation, our global storage depletes, threatening future agricultural viability.
To maximize yields, modern agriculture relies on several key practices. Irrigation is used to artificially supply water to crops. Fertilizers are applied to correct nutrient deficiencies in the soil, boosting plant growth and product quality. And pesticides are widely used to protect crops from pests and diseases, or to eliminate competition from weeds. The use of pesticides in particular has undergone massive changes since the Industrial Revolution.
The evolution of pesticides is a story of trial and error. Initially, farmers used broad-spectrum inorganic toxins, hoping to find a magic bullet. These early chemicals, like arsenic, were widely toxic. They efficiently killed pests, but they also wiped out beneficial organisms. Then there was a shift to natural plant chemicals. Plants naturally produce chemicals to defend against herbivores, like nicotine derived from tobacco. While these were safer for the environment, they just weren't as effective as farmers desired.
This led to the creation of artificial organic compounds like DDT. However, these brought complex ecological problems. They can cause secondary pest outbreaks. By eliminating the main pest, you reduce competition, allowing a completely different insect to multiply and become a new pest. Pests also rapidly develop genetic resistance to these chemicals. Furthermore, these broad-spectrum compounds have unexpected lingering environmental effects. For example, atrazine can remain in the soil for years and has been shown to cause the demasculinization and femininization of France, and even its breakdown products remain highly toxic.
To combat these toxic side effects, modern agriculture is shifting towards integrated pest management, or IPM. IPM controls pests by combining several methods, including both biological and chemical agents. The goal is to minimize the use of artificial chemicals and slow down the buildup of pest resistance. This often means moving away from strict monocultures and adopting no-till or low-till farming. A major component of IPM is biological control, which uses natural ecological interaction, like introducing natural predators, parasites, or competitors to keep pest populations in check.
With the human population booming, how do we keep up with food demand? There are several main strategies. First, we try to increase production per unit of surface area, heavily relying on genetically modified foods, which aligns with the cornucopian theory that human innovation will overcome resource limits. Second, we can simply increase total farmland area, though this leads to deforestation. Third, we develop new, higher-yielding crops and hybrids. Fourth, we implement better, more efficient watering methods like drip irrigation to conserve water while boosting yields.
A fifth strategy is the expansion of organic farming. This is a more natural approach that avoids artificial pesticides and genetically modified crops, focusing instead on soil health and sustainability. Finally, a highly effective strategy is eating lower on the food chain. By consuming more plant-based foods directly, rather than feeding those plants to livestock and eating the meat, we drastically reduce the amount of land and energy required to feed the population.
We must also consider other severe environmental impacts of agriculture. Desertification is the spread of desert-like conditions in arid or semi-arid regions, driven by overgrazing, poor farming practices, and climate change. Eutrophication occurs when fertilizer runoff dumps massive amounts of phosphates and nitrates into lakes and streams, causing explosive, suffocating algae growth. Finally, excessive irrigation in dry areas leads to soil salinization, where water evaporates and leaves behind a crust of soluble salts, ruining the soil's fertility.
While genetically modified foods help increase yields, they come with distinct risks. The fast and efficient development of new hybrids carries the risk of creating superhybrids, or having these crops interbreed with closely related wild plants to create unstoppable superweeds. Another controversial practice is the introduction of the terminator gene. This genetic modification makes the seeds of a crop sterile. While it prevents unwanted spreading, it forces farmers to buy new seeds every single year, creating massive socioeconomic burdens, especially for poor farmers in developing nations.
Shifting gears from agriculture, let's look at how modern society manages the physical materials it depends on. We categorize these into two types. Renewable resources, like timber, water, or air, are naturally or artificially recycled within a time frame that is actually useful for people. Non-renewable resources, however, are cycled so incredibly slowly by the Earth that once we use them, they won't be replaced within any human time framework. The key differentiator here is simply the speed of availability relative to a human lifespan.
Because resource availability dictates a society's wealth, we rely on materials management to ensure sustainable use. A core ideal of this is industrial ecology. Industrial ecology is the fascinating process of designing our industrial systems to behave exactly like natural ecosystems. In nature, there is no waste. The byproduct of one organism is food for another. Industrial ecology aims to replicate this, ensuring that the waste generated from one part of an industrial system is captured and used as a raw resource in another part. A major hurdle in managing resources is a concept called the tragedy of the commons. A commons is a resource that belongs to the public, like historical communal grazing lands. The tragedy is the observation that without collective control or regulation, it is always economically advantageous for an individual to maximize their own use of the resource. A farmer will add one more cow to the pasture because they get all the profit, while the environmental damage is shared by everyone. Today, we see this tragedy playing out in our oceans with overfishing and in our air with the dumping of atmospheric pollutants. To prevent the ruin of our commons, materials management pursues several specific regulatory goals. First, we must eliminate government subsidies that make extracting virgin materials like oil and timber artificially cheap. Second, we establish green building incentives to encourage the use of recycled materials. Third, we assess strict financial penalties for industries that practice poor waste management. Conversely, we provide financial incentives for processes that benefit the environment, specifically rewarding industries and agriculture that successfully implement industrial ecology by turning their waste into raw materials.
Let's look specifically at mineral resources, which are a valuable, non-renewable heritage from our geologic past. A mineral resource is any concentration of materials that can be extracted to obtain a usable commodity. When metals exist in high enough concentrations to be mined, we call it an ore deposit. Interestingly, these elements are not evenly distributed. Just 9 elements make up 99% of the Earth's crust, with oxygen and silicon being the most abundant, followed by industrial metals like aluminum and iron. It is crucial to distinguish between a mineral resource and a mineral reserve. While the resource is the total amount of a mineral present, a mineral reserve refers only to the concentrations that can be legally and economically extracted and sold at a profit at this exact moment in time. The legal component is key here. If environmental legislation prohibits mining in a certain area, that mineral cannot be counted as a reserve, even if we know it's there. Therefore, total resources always exceed known reserves. Extracting these reserves has massive impacts. Environmentally, while exploration has a minimal footprint, the actual mining and processing severely impact land, water, air, and local organisms. Because we usually extract the highest grades of ore first, we are increasingly forced to mine lower-grade ores, which requires moving more earth and causing far more environmental damage. Socially, mining causes a rapid influx of workers, straining local infrastructure. And when the ore runs out and the mine closes, it often leaves behind economically devastated ghost towns. To mitigate these severe effects, the industry must focus on minimizing impacts. This includes reclaiming and restoring land disturbed by mines, and stabilizing soils to prevent toxic metals from leaching into the environment. It requires strict control of air emissions and the rigorous treatment of contaminated water, both before it leaves the site and if it manages to escape. Ultimately, it relies on applying the 3 R's of waste management to the mining process itself, reducing the amount of waste produced, reusing materials, and maximizing recycling opportunities.
How we handle waste has evolved significantly. During the first century of the Industrial Revolution, the paradigm was dilute and disperse. Factories simply dumped waste into rivers, relying on the water to wash it away, a classic tragedy of the commons. As industry grew, this failed, so the approach shifted to concentrate and contain, putting waste in landfills or tailings ponds. But containment often fails, leading to acid mine drainage. Today, the environmentally correct approach is treating waste as a resource, embracing industrial ecology with the ultimate goal of zero waste. This modern approach is formalized as Integrated Waste Management, or IWM. IWM is a comprehensive set of alternatives that includes reuse, source reduction, recycling, composting, landfills, and incineration. The ultimate goal of IWM is to drastically reduce the volume of waste that ends up in landfills or incinerators. Metals like iron, aluminum, and copper are great success stories here. They are recycled in massive volumes because there is a huge economic market for them, and the environmental burden of mining new metals is simply too high.
Looking at everyday municipal solid waste, there are several management methods. First is on-site disposal, like garbage disposal units under kitchen sinks, which grind up food waste and send them to sewage plants for treatment. Second is composting. This is a biochemical process where organic materials decompose into a rich soil-like fertilizer. However, composting requires careful waste separation beforehand, and if you compost lawn clippings that were treated with herbicides, you risk concentrating those toxic chemicals in the final compost.
The third method is incineration, which burns combustible waste at extremely high temperatures, around 900 to 1,000 degrees Celsius. This drastically reduces the volume of waste to just ash, and the heat can be used to generate electricity. However, it can produce severe air pollution and highly toxic ash. The fourth and least desirable method is the open dump. These are poorly controlled sites where refuse is simply piled up and left uncovered, posing massive health and environmental risks, though they remain common in many rural areas.
To replace open dumps, we developed sanitary landfills. These are designed to dispose of solid waste without creating a hazard to public health or safety. They are not just holes in the ground, they are highly engineered structures equipped with multiple impermeable barriers and complex collection systems. The core operational idea is to confine the waste to the smallest practical area, compact it to the smallest possible volume, and cover it with a layer of compacted soil at the end of every single day to prevent pests and odors. Despite their engineering, sanitary landfills have significant issues, primarily the creation of leachate, a toxic liquid formed when water filters through the waste. Pollution can escape in many ways. Decomposing waste releases methane and ammonia gases into the atmosphere, heavy metals and soluble minerals can leach into the groundwater, and surface runoff can carry leachate directly into rivers. Plants growing on the site can even absorb heavy metals, introducing them into the food web. Because of these risks, site selection and continuous monitoring of monitoring wells are absolutely essential.
Historically, oceans have been used as massive dumping grounds for industrial, construction, hazardous, and urban waste. Because the ocean belongs to no single nation, this is a prime example of the tragedy of the commons. The environmental impacts are devastating. It causes the death and retarded growth of marine organisms, which in turn destroys commercial fisheries. The influx of organic waste drastically increases the biological oxygen demand, stripping the water of oxygen, leading to eutrophication and permanent habitat changes.
Ultimately, the best way to manage waste is pollution prevention, stopping the generation of waste in the first place, rather than just figuring out how to dispose of it. This involves purchasing the exact proper amount of raw materials so there is no excess. It requires exercising tighter control over manufacturing processes and improving engineering design to maximize efficiency. Crucially, it also involves substituting safe, non-toxic chemicals for the hazardous materials currently used in industrial processes. Now, let's transition to energy. Energy crises are not a modern invention. In ancient Greece, people relied heavily on charcoal derived from wood to heat their homes. By the 5th century BC, they had completely depleted their local forests. To survive, they adapted by designing their cities to maximize passive solar energy. The Romans faced a similar crisis. Wealthy Romans burned up to 125 kilograms of wood per hour for central heating and bathhouses. When their wood ran out, they too turned to solar energy, even passing legislation to guarantee a citizen's right to sunlight. To understand our modern energy landscape, we need some basics. Energy is simply the capacity to do work, and work is defined as force multiplied by distance. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It only changes forms. We have potential energy, which is stored energy, like water held behind a dam or the chemical bonds in petrol. Kinetic energy is the energy of actual motion. Heat energy is the random motion of atoms. Remember, when energy changes form, its quality degrades. High-quality energy is easy to convert to work, while low-quality heat energy is very difficult to harness. The vast majority of our energy comes from fossil fuels, coal, crude oil, and natural gas. These are essentially ancient, stored solar energy created from the incomplete decomposition of dead organic matter. Oil and gas form primarily from phytoplankton deposited on the ocean floor millions of years ago. As these sediments are buried deep underground, they are slowly heated to between 100 and 150 degrees Celsius. If it's too cool, no oil forms. If it's too hot, it turns into natural gas. Once formed, the oil migrates upward until it gets trapped in porous reservoir rock beneath an impermeable layer of caprock. Coal forms differently. It begins in swampy environments where plant growth outpaces decomposition, leading to the accumulation of thick organic layers called peat. Over time, overlying sediments compact this peat, squeezing out oxygen and hydrogen in the form of water, which concentrates the carbon. Depending on the heat and pressure, different types of coal form. Anthracite has the highest energy and carbon content at 93%. Bituminous coal, which makes up most of South Africa's reserves, is around 85% partin, followed by subbituminous, and finally lignite, or brown coal, which has the lowest heat and pressure history. When we extract oil, we start with primary production, simply pumping it from the well. However, this only recovers about 25% of the oil in a reservoir. To get more, we use enhanced methods, injecting steam, water, or gases like carbon dioxide into the reservoir to push the remaining oil upward. When we talk about how much oil we have left, we refer to proven reserves, the specific amount that has been identified and can be extracted at a profit right now. The total resource in the ground is always much larger, but it may be too expensive to extract or not yet fully proven. Beyond standard oil and coal, we utilize other fossil fuels. Natural gas, primarily methane, is often found alongside crude oil and is considered a relatively clean-burning fuel. We also have coal bed methane, which is methane trapped directly within coal seams. Extracting it before mining the coal prevents it from escaping into the atmosphere, but the extraction process generates massive amounts of wastewater. Finally, there are methane hydrates, methane trapped in ice-like cages on the deep ocean floor. These hold twice as much energy as all other known fossil fuel deposits combined, but they are highly unstable and difficult to safely extract. The environmental cost of oil and gas is immense. On land, recovery requires massive infrastructure, causes land subsidence, and frequently pollutes groundwater through leaks and the surfacing of salty water. In marine environments, drilling releases toxic, heavy metal-laden drilling muds and causes chronic oil seepage. The refining process is notorious for slow leaks that contaminate surrounding soils. However, some of the most catastrophic environmental impacts occur during delivery, when pipelines rupture or massive oil tankers spill their cargo into fragile marine ecosystems. Coal mining is equally destructive. Strip mining, a surface technique, is cheap and easy, but devastates the landscape. When surface water enters the exposed spoil banks, it reacts with sulfide minerals like pyrite to produce highly toxic sulfuric acid, known as acid mine drainage. Underground mining is incredibly dangerous to workers, risking shaft collapses, explosions, and black lung disease. It also causes land subsidence, acid mine drainage, and can ignite underground coal fires that burn uncontrollably for decades. To reduce our reliance on these destructive fuels, we must optimize our use. Energy conservation simply means using less energy and adjusting our daily needs to minimize waste. Increased energy efficiency involves engineering better equipment that yields more output from the same amount of input fuel. A fantastic example of efficiency is cogeneration. In traditional power plants, a massive amount of energy is lost as waste heat. Cogeneration captures that waste heat and uses it to heat nearby buildings or power other industrial processes, rather than just venting it as thermal pollution. We are also transitioning to alternative energy, which encompasses any resource used as an alternative to fossil fuels. This is split into two categories. Renewable energy includes sources like solar, wind, water, and biomass, which are continuously replenished by nature within a human time framework. Alternative non-renewable energy includes nuclear and geothermal power. While they don't burn fossil fuels, they rely on specific earthly resources, like uranium or deep earth heat, that can eventually be depleted in a specific location. Let's look at solar energy. Incredibly, just 10 weeks of incoming solar energy equals the energy in all known fossil fuel reserves combined. We harness this in two ways. Passive solar energy uses architectural design, like window overhangs, heat-absorbing walls, and planting deciduous trees, to heat and cool buildings naturally, without any mechanical power. Active solar energy requires machinery. This includes solar collectors, which pump water through dark sun-heated tubes, and photovoltaics, which use semiconductor materials to convert sunlight directly into electricity. On an industrial scale, we use solar thermal generators. These systems use massive arrays of mirrors to focus sunlight onto a central water-holding container, often called a solar power tower. The intense heat boils the water, and the resulting steam drives a conventional turbine to generate electricity. The environmental impact of solar energy is relatively very low. The main concerns are simply the environmental costs associated with mining and manufacturing the metals, glass, and plastics required to build the panels and mirrors. Water power is one of humanity's oldest energy sources, evolving from simple water wheels to massive hydroelectric dams. Because electricity is hard to store, dams often use pumped storage systems. During the night, when energy demand is low, excess electricity from the grid is used to pump water from a lower pool up into a high reservoir. Then, during peak daytime hours, when demand is high, that water is released back down through the turbines, generating a massive surge of electricity exactly when it's needed. While hydroelectric power is clean because it doesn't burn fuel, it carries heavy environmental costs. Creating the necessary reservoirs floods massive tracts of land, destroying terrestrial habitats. The physical dams completely block the natural migration patterns of fish, like salmon, and trap vital sediments that downstream ecosystems and agricultural lands rely on. Furthermore, the large, still surface area of the reservoir drastically increases water loss through evaporation and fundamentally destroys the natural state of wild rivers. We can also harness the ocean through tidal power. Tides are driven by the gravitational pull of the moon and sun. In areas with the right topography, we can build a dam across a bay. As the tide rises, water is allowed in. When the tide recedes, the water is held back and then released through turbines to generate electricity. However, this severely disrupts the natural hydrology of the estuary, restricts the passage of marine life, and creates rapidly fluctuating water levels that destroy local habitats. Wind power is another ancient technology, driven by the differential heating of the Earth's surface, which creates moving air masses. For modern commercial wind farms, a site needs an average wind velocity of about 18 kilometers per hour, making it highly dependent on local topography, like mountain ridges and passes that naturally funnel the wind. While clean, wind power does have impacts. The spinning turbine blades are known to kill birds and bats, and many people object to the aesthetic degradation of natural scenery. Biofuels represent energy derived from organic matter, or biomass. This includes everything from firewood and peat to modern crops grown specifically to be converted into liquid fuels like ethanol. Wood is the oldest fuel used by humans, and over 1 billion people still rely on it daily. However, industrial biofuel production has severe impacts. Growing crops for fuel instead of food escalates global food prices. It also competes directly for scarce water and arable land, and requires the intense, polluting use of fertilizers and pesticides. Finally, we have geothermal energy, which taps into the Earth's natural heat. Deep Earth systems tap into high-density reservoirs of steam and hot water deep underground to spin turbines and produce electricity. Shallow Earth systems use the low-density solar heat stored just below the surface to heat buildings. While geothermal plants can produce highly corrosive wastewater and localized gas emissions, the massive benefit is that they produce 90% less carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide than a comparable coal power station. This wraps up our look at resources and energy, setting the stage for our next discussion on environmental health, pollution, and toxicology. Let's dive right into the concept of sustainability. In environmental science, sustainability has two formal meanings. First, it refers to the sustainability of resources, like ensuring we don't deplete global fish stocks. Second, it refers to the sustainability of an entire ecosystem. A crucial part of this is the carrying capacity, which is the maximum number of individuals of a species that an environment can support indefinitely, without degrading the environment's ability to support that same population in the future. Environmental issues often require a global perspective because impacts frequently transcend national boundaries. For example, the emission of greenhouse gases in one country contributes to global climate change, affecting everyone. Even natural processes can have global consequences. Around 2 billion years ago, the accumulation of free oxygen in the atmosphere led to what we call the oxygen crisis, fundamentally changing life on Earth. We are increasingly becoming an urban species. Today, urban areas are home to over 4.2 billion people, the majority of the world's population. Between 2015 and 2020 alone, urban populations grew by about 397 million people, with over 90% of this growth in less developed countries. In 2008, we crossed a threshold where more than half the global population lived in cities. The number of megacities, those with over 10 million people, jumped from just 2 in 1950 to 22 by 2005. Because many of these large cities are located along rivers and coastlines, they face disproportionate environmental impacts, such as flooding and sea level rise. People and nature are intimately integrated. We affect the environment, and it affects us. How we view and use the environment depends heavily on our value systems. There are 8 primary justifications for valuing the environment: utilitarian, ecological, aesthetic, recreational, moral, cultural, inspirational, and creative. We'll focus primarily on the first 2. The utilitarian justification is materialistic. It argues that some aspect of the environment is valuable because it provides economic benefits or is directly necessary for human survival. For instance, conserving wildlife can be justified by the economic benefits of ecotourism. On the other hand, the ecological justification argues that an ecosystem is valuable because it's necessary for the survival of certain species, or because the system itself provides essential benefits. An example is conserving mangrove ecosystems because they serve as nurseries for fish that are crucial to the broader marine ecology. Let's define some basic concepts in environmental health. Disease is an impairment of an individual's well-being and ability to function, often resulting from a poor adjustment between the individual and their environment. Pollution refers to an unwanted change in the environment caused by the introduction of harmful materials or conditions. Contamination is similar, specifically meaning making something unfit for a particular use by introducing undesirable materials. A toxin is a substance that is poisonous to living things, and toxicology is the science that studies these toxins. It's a common misconception that nature is always safe and human activities are the sole cause of contamination. A tragic example is Lake Nyos in Cameroon. On August 21, 1986, there was a massive natural release of carbon dioxide. The gas had been building up from volcanic vents at the bottom of the lake, kept in place by the pressure of the overlying water. When the water was agitated, likely by a small landslide or earthquake, the gas rapidly moved to the surface. Because carbon dioxide is denser than air, it flowed downslope into surrounding villages, tragically killing 1,800 people and numerous animals by asphyxiation. Moving on to specific types of toxins, a carcinogen is a toxin that increases the risk of cancer. Another critical concept is synergism. This occurs when the interaction of different substances results in a total effect that is greater than the sum of their individual effects. For example, sulfur dioxide and coal dust particles each cause adverse health effects on their own, but when they combine, the sulfur dioxide adheres to the coal dust. This allows the toxic gas to be inhaled much deeper into the lungs, causing significantly greater damage than either substance could alone. When tracking pollution, we categorize its sources. Point sources are readily identified and stationary, like a factory smokestack or a specific drain pipe. Area sources, also known as non-point sources, are diffuse and harder to pinpoint, such as urban runoff flowing into a river or broad industrial air pollution. Finally, mobile sources are exactly what they sound like, sources of air pollutants that move from place to place, with automobiles being the most common example. To understand the impact of a pollutant, we must measure its abundance, and the units we use vary widely. For large-scale emissions, like wastewater entering a bay, we might use millions of liters per day. For trace chemicals, we use small units, like parts per million or parts per billion. In water, you'll often see milligrams per liter or micrograms per liter.
When measuring the concentration of a toxin stored in the tissue of an organism, we typically use milligrams per kilogram. Pollutants come in many forms. We generally classify them into 10 major categories: environmentally transmitted infectious diseases, toxic heavy metals, organic compounds, persistent organic pollutants, hormonally active agents, nuclear radiation, thermal pollution, particulates, asbestos, and noise pollution. Let's explore some of these in more detail. Environmentally transmitted infectious diseases cause the greatest mortality in developing countries. These diseases spread through our interaction with contaminated food, water, air, soil, and animals. Because they can be controlled by manipulating the environment, like improving sanitation, they are considered environmental health concerns. Examples include Legionnaire's disease, which spreads through aerosols from hot water pipes or AC units, food poisoning from salmonella, cholera from contaminated water, malaria spread by mosquitoes, and anthrax, whose spores can survive in the soil and infect humans via inhalation or wounds. Toxic heavy metals pose significant health hazards to people and ecosystems. This group includes metals like mercury, lead, cadmium, arsenic, and even gold and silver. While they can be found naturally in uncontaminated soil and water, human activities like mining, refining, and industrial processes concentrate them to dangerous levels. A major concern is that heavy metals can accumulate and be stored in fatty body tissue. The total amount of a toxic chemical stored in an individual is referred to as their body burden. This accumulation leads to a dangerous process called biomagnification or bioaccumulation. As a toxic substance like a heavy metal moves up through the food web, its concentration increases. An organism at the first trophic level might absorb a tiny amount, but a predator at the second level eats many of those organisms, absorbing all their toxins. By the time you reach the fourth trophic level, the concentration of the toxin per individual is massively magnified, often reaching lethal levels for top predators. Let's look at a specific example with cadmium, a metal that increases the risk of heart disease. Cadmium is present in coal in very low concentrations. When coal is burned, the ash is collected and placed in a landfill, which is then covered with soil and vegetation. The plants growing there continually take up cadmium from the soil, concentrating it 3 to 5 times higher than the soil levels. Herbivores eat the plants, and carnivores eat the herbivores. By the time that cadmium is incorporated into human tissue at the top of the food web, its concentration is 50 to 60 times higher than it was in the original soil. Next, we have organic compounds. These are carbon-based compounds that can be produced naturally or synthetically for uses like pest control and pharmaceuticals. A particularly dangerous subset are persistent organic pollutants, or POPs. These are synthetic, often contain highly reactive chlorine, and as the name suggests, they persist. They do not easily break down in the environment. They are soluble in fat, meaning they biomagnify, and they can be transported long distances by wind and water. Well-known examples include the pesticide DDT, atrazine, and dioxins. There are several other notable categories of pollutants. Hormonally active agents, like atrazine, can cause reproductive and developmental abnormalities in animals and humans by mimicking hormones. Thermal pollution occurs when excess heat, often from power plants, is released into water or air, disrupting local ecosystems. Particulates are tiny particles of dust, soot, or heavy metals suspended in the air. Asbestos refers to minerals that form microscopic, elongated fibers that cause severe lung damage when inhaled. Finally, noise pollution is unwanted and potentially damaging sound, measured in decibels. A fundamental principle in toxicology is dose response. The effect of a chemical on an individual depends entirely on the dose or concentration. Many chemicals exhibit threshold effects. This is a specific level below which no harmful effects are observable, but once that threshold is crossed, the effects suddenly become apparent. We also classify effects by time. An acute effect occurs very soon after exposure, usually to a large amount of a toxin. A chronic effect, however, occurs over a long period, often resulting from continuous exposure to low levels of a pollutant. To quantify toxicity, we use dose-response curves. The ED50, or effective dose, is the concentration that causes a specific, observable effect in 50% of the exposed population. The TD50, or toxic dose, is the level that is actively toxic to 50% of the population. Finally, the LD50 is the lethal dose, the grim metric defining the concentration at which 50% of the exposed population dies. These metrics help regulators set safety limits for chemical exposure. Organisms can sometimes develop tolerance, which is the ability to withstand stress from exposure to a pollutant. This happens in three ways. Behavioral tolerance involves an organism changing its habits to avoid the toxin. Physiological tolerance occurs when an individual's body physically adjusts to handle a higher level of the pollutant. Genetic tolerance is an evolutionary process. Some individuals are naturally more resistant to a toxin, survive the exposure, and pass those resistant genes to the next generation.
Let's shift our focus to water pollution, which is broadly defined as the degradation of water quality. When determining if water is polluted, we must consider its intended use. Drinking water has stricter standards than irrigation water. We also look at how far it departs from its natural state, its effects on public health, and its ecological impacts. A water pollutant is any biological, physical, or chemical substance present in excess that harms desirable living organisms. This includes heavy metals, sediment, heat, excess nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, and pathogenic bacteria.
A critical metric for water quality is biochemical oxygen demand, or BOD. Healthy aquatic ecosystems require dissolved oxygen. When dead organic matter, like raw sewage, enters a stream, it begins to decay. The bacteria responsible for this decomposition consume oxygen. If there is a massive amount of organic matter, bacterial activity spikes, and they consume so much oxygen that fish and other organisms suffocate and die. Therefore, a high BOD and low dissolved oxygen levels are strong indicators of a polluted stream. Another major water quality issue is waterborne diseases. We test for fecal coliform bacteria, which occur naturally in the intestines of humans and other warm-blooded animals. While not all of these bacteria are harmful, their presence is used as a standard indicator that water has been contaminated with fecal material, meaning dangerous pathogens could be present. A well-known example is certain strains of E. coli, which can cause severe human illness and even death if ingested through contaminated water. Excess nutrients, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus from fertilizers and wastewater, lead to a destructive process called eutrophication. When these nutrients enter a lake, they supercharge the growth of aquatic plants and algae. The algae rapidly multiply, forming thick surface mats that block sunlight from reaching plants deeper in the water. Eventually, these massive algal blooms die off. The bacteria that decompose the dead algae consume massive amounts of oxygen, spiking the BOD and creating a dead zone where fish cannot survive. Lakes naturally fall into different categories based on their nutrient levels. An oligotrophic lake has a low concentration of nutrients. The water is crystal clear and it supports a relatively low abundance of life. In contrast, a naturally eutrophic lake has high nutrient concentrations, making the water murky and teeming with life, including algae. However, when human activities like agriculture and sewage discharge rapidly dump nutrients into a water body, we cause cultural eutrophication, artificially and destructively accelerating this process. Acid mine drainage is a severe form of water pollution. It occurs when water with a high concentration of sulfuric acid drains from coal or metal mines. This happens when minerals like pyrite, exposed by mining, react with oxygen and water to produce sulfuric acid and iron hydroxide, which often stains the water a toxic orange color. As this highly acidic water runs off into natural streams, it devastates local ecosystems. Even long-abandoned mines continue to generate acid mine drainage, making it a persistent environmental challenge. To combat water pollution, cities rely on wastewater treatment plants, which process sewage through primary, secondary, and sometimes advanced treatment stages before releasing it. We also increasingly rely on water reuse. Inadvertent reuse happens naturally when a city discharges treated water into a river and another city downstream withdraws it for drinking. Indirect reuse is a planned effort, like using treated wastewater to irrigate agricultural fields. Direct reuse is when highly treated wastewater is piped directly from the plant back into the municipal water supply for the next user. Let's move up into the atmosphere and discuss air pollution. Because the atmosphere behaves like a fast-flowing fluid, humans have historically used it as a convenient dumping ground for unwanted gases. This isn't just a modern issue. Acid rain was described in the 17th century, and the term smog was coined in 1905. Air pollution has sweeping effects. It reduces visibility, stunts plant growth, impairs animal respiratory systems, acidifies soil and water, degrades buildings, and is a major driver of human health crises like asthma and cancer.
We classify air pollutants into two main types. Primary pollutants are emitted directly into the atmosphere from a source. Examples include particulates, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and nitrogen oxides.
Secondary pollutants are not emitted directly. Instead, they form in the air when primary pollutants react with normal atmospheric compounds, often facilitated by sunlight. A prime example is ground-level ozone. It's also important to note that pollutants can have natural origins, such as sulfur dioxide from volcanoes or particulates from wildfires.
Let's look at 3 common primary pollutants. Sulfur dioxide primarily comes from burning coal. It severely damages the lungs and is a major precursor to acid rain. Nitrogen oxides come from automobile exhaust and power plants. They are key ingredients in smog and acid rain, and when they settle into water bodies, they contribute to eutrophication. Carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless gas from the incomplete burning of fuels. It is incredibly dangerous because it binds to hemoglobin in our blood 250 times faster than oxygen, effectively suffocating the body from the inside. Air toxics are specific pollutants known to cause cancer or serious neurological and reproductive diseases, even in small volumes. Examples include highly corrosive hydrogen sulfide and methyl isocyanate, which caused the tragic Bhopal disaster. Another major issue is smog, a mixture of smoke and fog. There are 2 main types. Sulfurous smog, or London-type smog, is driven by burning coal and is rich in sulfur oxides. Photochemical smog, or LA-type smog, is driven by automobile exhaust. Nitrogen oxides and hydrocarbons react chemically in the presence of sunlight to create a toxic brownish haze. How do we control air pollution? The absolute best approach is to reduce emissions at the source. When that's not possible, we must capture pollutants before they reach the atmosphere. For sulfur dioxide, power plants can switch to low-sulfur coal or wash the coal beforehand, though this is expensive. A common technological solution is wet scrubbing. As exhaust gases travel up the smokestack, they are sprayed with a slurry of limestone. The limestone reacts with the sulfur dioxide gas, turning it into solid calcium sulfite, which falls to the bottom and is safely removed. While ozone in the lower atmosphere is a pollutant, stratospheric ozone is vital because it absorbs harmful ultraviolet radiation from the sun. However, human-made chemicals called CFCs, once common in refrigerants, threaten this layer. Because CFCs don't break down in the lower atmosphere, they drift up to the stratosphere. There, intense UV radiation splits them, releasing highly reactive chlorine atoms. A single chlorine atom rips apart an ozone molecule, then gets released to do it again. This catalytic chain reaction means one CFC molecule can destroy 100,000 ozone molecules. Finally, let's discuss global warming and climate change. First, we must distinguish between weather and climate. Weather refers to short-term conditions, what's happening today or this week. Climate is the average of those weather conditions over long periods, usually decades. To study climate change, scientists use the instrumental record, which includes direct measurements from thermometers and satellites. We also look at historical records like farmers' logs. But to look back thousands of years, we use paleoproxy records, indirect evidence of past climates preserved in ice cores, tree rings, lake sediments, and coral reefs. Earth's climate has always changed naturally, cycling between cold glacial periods and warm interglacial periods. A major driver of these natural cycles are the Milankovitch cycles. These are long-term variations in how the Earth moves through space. They include the wobble of Earth's axis, changes in the angle of its tilt, and the eccentricity of its orbit, meaning how elliptical or circular its path around the Sun is. These cycles alter how much solar energy hits the Earth, driving natural climate shifts over tens of thousands of years. However, the rapid warming we see today is driven by the greenhouse effect. Here's how it works. The Earth receives high-energy short-wave radiation from the Sun. The Earth's surface absorbs this energy, warms up, and emits it back towards space as lower-energy, long-wave infrared radiation. Greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, like carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor, are transparent to incoming sunlight, but absorb that outgoing infrared radiation. They trap the heat and re-radiate it back to the surface. Naturally, this keeps Earth habitable, but human activities are thickening this blanket, trapping too much heat. The potential effects of this warming are profound. We are seeing retreating glaciers, rapidly declining Arctic sea ice, and rising sea levels, caused by both melting ice and the thermal expansion of warmer water. This threatens coastal cities and island nations. To adjust, humanity must take a two-pronged approach. First, we must adapt, learning to live with the changes already locked in, perhaps by building coastal defenses.
Second, and most importantly, we must mitigate the damage by drastically reducing greenhouse gas emissions through energy conservation, transitioning away from fossil fuels, and committing to international climate agreements. That wraps up our comprehensive look at environmental science themes.